Hello, my name is Jonathan Haber, an educational consultant working with IMS Global on the CASE network. And this video is designed to familiarize you with some of the editorial decisions that go into creating a framework for CASE network. What we're trying to do is come up with a system whereby new frameworks, regardless of who is creating them, either IMS or the states or a third party, will all follow consistent guidelines, or at least understand some of the decisions we made when we were building frameworks so that you can design your frameworks consistently with what's already in CASE network. Now, I'm assuming that people watching this video are already familiar with CASE network. You understand that when it was originally created, we built two standards, an ELA and a math standard for each of the 50 states. Now, since then, some states have updated their standards. Some states have added additional standards for other subjects, either working with IMS or themselves or working with third parties. And when when IMS has either developed a standard or has been working with somebody, we've stressed the sort of consistent set of processes we use, again, to try to make standards consistent from one state to the next and from one standard to the next. So the two things to keep in mind are the key principles that we've used when we build framework. The first is loyalty to the documentation provided by the state. Now, in some cases, like in the case of Connecticut, they are a straight Common Core state, so the documentation we cover is Common Core. In other cases, like in Kentucky, they have built their own standards, which may be similar to Common Core, may be completely different than Common Core. But the idea is the documentation should be considered the source of truth. Okay, what the state considers to be their standards. And the reason I'm mentioning the documentation is even in cases where you might be getting standards data, the text strings, etc., from a source such as a spreadsheet or database output or some other way of getting the data, the documentation still provides important information on how a framework should be structured. For example, if you look at this Common Core standards documentation, you could see the hierarchy starting with counting and cardinality, leading down to no number names in the counting sequence, down to standards. Okay, and if we look at this in CASE network, and again, I'll pick Connecticut since that's a straight Common Core state. Okay, let's open up that math framework. And you will see that we break it down just like the documentation does, right? You've got your grade level, kindergarten, you've got your domain, counting and cardinality, you've got what's called a cluster, which is, in this case, this is assigned a human code KCCA, no number names in the count sequence, and then you've got your standards. Okay, in some cases, standards might get broken down into smaller pieces. That also is reflected in the framework. A couple things you'll notice: there is metadata associated with every item in the framework. Kindergarten is a grade level, that's the item type, that's associated with an education level kindergarten, down to domains, clusters, and standards. And below standards, when a standard is broken up into multiple parts, we assign that as a component. Now, you should note that information on what these different components are called, what category they fall into, is included elsewhere in the documentation, sort of in the kind of front matter in the documentation. So again, when you're following a standards document, read that material so you can understand how this information is to be assigned. Okay, now a few things. States do present their information in different ways. In some cases, it might be a grid with sort of multiple grade levels. But in general, the second principle, I mentioned loyalty to documentation as the first principle. The second principle is to try to keep standards consistent with one another, right? If you look at Georgia's math standards, we just looked at Connecticut's. Georgia's are similar to math standards. They have a structure and item data that is akin to Common Core, but they have some of their own information. You'll see we still break this down based on grade level. Right? You've got kindergarten, domain, cluster, standard. They use different item codes. They have some different ways of arranging, but we tried to keep the standards consistent with one another. Similarly, when you get to something that's completely different than Common Core, say Virginia, for example, Virginia has its own math standards that are not influenced by Common Core. But even here, we try to break things down to grade level, strand, what they refer to it, and then standard. Okay, so those are the two principles are one, adherence to and loyalty to the documentation, followed by consistency from framework to framework. Where this is particularly relevant is if we take a look at the ELA Common Core standards, right? In this case, and I'll blow this up a little bit, okay, the Common Core writing standards, starting at grade 3, have standards, a writing standard followed by components, A, B, C, D. And again, if we look at a Common Core state like Connecticut, you could see that we have broken standards down all the way down to the component level. So this indicates that one of the editorial processes is when the documentation shows components, those components should be included as separate items in the framework, okay, just as they are in the documentation. And again, we could look at a state that is different from Common Core, although it has similar structure, Kentucky in this case. And again, you've got a standard followed by components. And in the Kentucky ELA framework, that is reflected in the way the standard is structured. Okay, so if we look at writing standards, which they refer to as composition, you've got the strand, the cluster, the standard, and then individual components. Now again, states will vary in terms of what they call these things, how they use human codes, this sort of coding system. They'll vary in their metadata. So again, we want to be loyal to the documentation, but within that context, we want to be consistent from one framework to another. So we'll provide you a set of editorial guidelines as well as support in terms of reviewing your work as you go through it. One thing we tend to recommend, is what we do when we work with a client, is initially we build a framework just for kindergarten standards so that the client can review it and make sure that it adheres to what they're looking for a standard structure, for the structure of framework. And once we do that, then we can use that as a model to build out the rest of the grades. Thank you for your attention, and please follow up with us if you need more information.